Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's turn to Bernie Sanders, who recently introduced the 32-Hour Workweek Act, which he argues would move the U.S. to a 32-hour work week over 4 years with, quote, no loss of pay. Let's listen to Bernie tangling with a Fox Business reporter over this idea last week.
We held a hearing on a 32-hour work week because what we have seen is that over the last 50 years, despite a huge increase in worker productivity, almost all of the new wealth has gone to the top 1%, while 60% of the people are living paycheck to paycheck. Many of our people are exhausted. We work the longest hours of any people in the industrialized world. I think it's time for a shortened work week.
Can I ask you a question about that? It seems like Democrats want businesses to be taxed more,
that's not my assumption.
Pay their workers more,
so.
Lower prices, and now pay people not to work.
You know what I would like to see?
How are businesses going to survive that? That's the question. How can businesses survive all of those proposals?
When Mr. Bezos pays an effective tax rate lower than the average worker, I think we have a real problem in our tax system. I think that billionaires have got to start paying their fair share of taxes.
Kim, what do you make of this idea from the Vermont independent socialist? It seems to me this has no chance of passing in the current Senate, but it's notable that Bernie Sanders has proved in some cases to be the leading edge of his party on things like Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, which used to be laughed at and now are increasingly adopted by mainstream Democrats.
Yes, be scared, very, very scared, because if Bernie starts to push it, it will very soon become the demand of the left and part of their platform and what they begin pushing for in the Senate. Now, this is absolutely nuts, by the way. In fact, I heard one conservative critic say it's a little bit like a high school kid running for elementary school president and promising to get rid of homework and make every day ice cream Friday. But we do have to know that there have been moves like this to do stuff equivalent. I mean, France, for instance, has a less than 40-hour work week, a 35-hour work week. You've had some states that have investigated a 4-day work week. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania hasn't gone anywhere. Now, the reason it hasn't is because there are enormous economic consequences for this. It's all well and good to have these people say, oh, you know, one of the benefits of artificial intelligence and automation and new technology is it's just going to free up humanity to think big thoughts and they won't have to work as much every day. Maybe, but we are not there yet. And these kind of proposals right now, they would put extraordinary strain, in particular on small businesses. You'd end up with fewer jobs. You'd end up with increased inflation as a function of how this all washed out in wages. You'd probably have more automation, which is weird because one of the people that's supporting this is Sean Fain, the head of United Auto Workers, and they have been fighting against automation because it loses unions jobs, many of them. So it is not a well thought out proposal. But as you heard there, it's in keeping with this rage that many on the left have, that there are some people in society that have a lot of money. And I guess until everybody in their perfect world, much like old-fashioned Soviets, can make everybody equal in some way, shape, or form, they're not going to rest.
Alicia, my thought is that the money has to come from somewhere, and it is amazing how this legislation attempts to simply decree that it will not come from anywhere. So there's one piece of this that Bernie keeps pointing to say employers would not be able to cut your wages as a result of this 20% decrease in hours worked. And here is what the legislation says with respect to employees brought within the purview of this section. The employer may not reduce the total workweek compensation rate or any other employee benefit. And I guess that prompts two thoughts from me. One is that, okay, so if the employer cannot reduce the total workweek compensation rate, what if the employer just stops giving out raises? And if you have 5% employment for a few years, then pretty soon you are back where you started without any of this protection that Bernie Sanders is promising. And what about new hires? Maybe the Bernie legislation would be able to protect people who are brought within the purview of his 32-hour Workweek Act if they're already employed. But it seems to me that one obvious choice for a business would be to hire new employees on different terms. And then you'd end up with a labor market that is fractured and people not wanting to leave jobs they've had for a long time because they are grandfathered in to this 32-hour workweek act under their old wages, and they don't want to take a new job. I agree with Kim. This seems like it is not very thought out, not very workable. And I don't know. I mean, does Bernie even want this to pass, or is this a messaging bill?
Well, a couple points. What you were getting at is the distortionary effects, which are always very hard to predict and can depend on the elasticity of the labor market and so forth. And if you're in a recession, you'll probably see layoffs. I think that's invariable. The irony, of course, is that the people who would be hurt most by this are, working class people, because it would apply to wage earners, and people on salary wouldn't really affect, right? And another point is that, France enshrined a 35-hour work week in 2000, and they thought, if everyone was working less, then this would force employers to hire more people. That hasn't actually turned out to be. In fact, unemployment remains pretty high in France and higher than the other places that have 40-hour work weeks. And the labor mobility is quite low. People, as you mentioned, and there are other reasons for that, job protections in France, but the labor market is pretty sclerotic. And that's one reason France, its GDP, its economy has grown much slower than the U.S. Now, does Bernie actually want this to pass? Yes, I think he does. I think he actually believes in this. He's not a serious economist, would laugh this out, including those on the left, because they know how distortionary the impact of this would be. But I think, as you point out, he's an ideologue and a demagogue. So I think he's really pushing this just because it's kind of a socialistic idea that corporations should have to pay workers more, even though they work less. Again, this would be equivalent to about a 20% de facto raise. And this is a way to squeeze corporations, in fact, when it would actually squeeze workers.
And my last thought on this is I think that Bernie is ignoring the massive increase in living standards. So he says, this is a quote from his press release, "Today, American workers are over 400% more productive than they were in the 1940s. And yet millions of Americans are working longer hours for lower wages than they were decades ago." But go back to the 1940 census and look at the percentage of homes that did not have any refrigeration, or were using ice as refrigeration, or did not have central heat, or did not even have a radio, did not have a flush toilet. Look at the healthcare that we have, the better food that we have, the longer lifespans. The Social Security Administration says life expectancy at birth in 1940 was 61.5 for males and 65.7 for females. And yes, most people work 40 hours a week or more than that, but they are also having all of these better amenities and often long retirements. Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break. Let's take a question from a listener. Trevor in Pittsburgh says he's a longtime listener of the podcast, but a first-time writer to our email address. He had a question about the House bill requiring TikTok to no longer be a Chinese company, and he says he fears that it's a slippery slope. Is there no way for the free market to intervene in the situation? Apple and Google have no problem removing apps from their stores. Why is there no public pressure for them to block new downloads of TikTok? Unquote. Kim, what do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I love it when people write in questions to us. And this is a very good one because it's a thoughtful one. And I am completely in agreement, always have been, that if there's any scenario that is remotely possible in which we can look to the free market to solve something, that's what we should be doing. We have a history in which we make this mistake again and again in too many situations in which you get a company that's very large, very popular. There's some concern about it. Pretty soon, public sentiment and political sentiment is that government needs to intervene. I can't even tell you the long list of companies that when in fact, even when left alone and there wasn't government interference, they are now in the dustbin of history simply because they didn't manage to continue competing. And so while they looked dominant and important at a time, the market itself corrected many of those problems. However, we have always understood that there are some very unique circumstances in which the free market alone can't function, in part because of political interference. And that includes by foreign adversaries who seek to use companies to, for instance, gather intelligence or somehow engage in an enterprise that is designed to damage or undermine the security of the United States. It's why we have federal bodies like the Committee on Foreign Investment, which looks at some of these things. That this doesn't mean that, by the way, you should get nervous every time a Japanese company comes and buys a skyscraper in New York, but it's an admission that some countries are indeed our adversaries and use corporations. And that's the situation you're talking about in TikTok. It's great to think, for instance, that maybe you could get another buyer for TikTok, that this would happen organically. It's clearly not going to happen so long as the Chinese government is benefiting from getting information from this firm and isn't going to willingly allow it to be sold. And I guess, yes, you could rally pressure on Google and Apple to do that, except for that public opinion right now, it's a mercurial thing. And there's about as many people in the country that adore TikTok as those that recognize the threat from it. And in that scenario, neither Google or Apple is going to somehow eliminate this incredibly popular app that is on their site at the moment. So I think that we sometimes have to look at certain scenarios and say, this is simply a big problem from a national security perspective. I worry, too, about the slippery slope. I hope that this is not a situation that puts us where you can easily start banning other companies right and left on spurious national security reasonings. But at the same time, too, I got to hope, or at least pray, that those are getting these national security briefings in Congress are hearing evidence that really does give them cause for concern.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.